Hey everyone, my name is Joanna Hoffman, and I'm a spoken word poet and teaching artist in Brooklyn, New York. I may have met some of you when I've come in the past to teach poetry workshops and perform poems. If not, great to be meeting you now. And what I'm going to be doing in this video is talking a little bit about my experiences in poetry and spoken word. I'm going to talk a little bit about storytelling techniques that I've found really helpful in crafting my own poetry and performances. And then I'm going to perform a poem for you all. So I have been writing poetry for much of my life. I started writing poetry probably when I was in middle school. Let me think, maybe fifth grade. But for me, it was just such a tremendously helpful outlet. It actually helped me get to know myself better because I felt like sometimes I could be more honest in my poems than I could in other areas of my life. And I also really just fell in love with poetry actually through song lyrics. I loved Tori Amos. I still really love Tori Amos. And I used to just read her lyrics, and she's such like an interesting writer. And I just started to, anytime I had like a CD that I really liked, I would look at the lyrics and think about them as poetry, which often lyrics are. And that's really how I got into writing poetry myself. Um, I also, in high school, really liked Ani DeFranco, who, if you're familiar with Ani DeFranco's music, she also like weaves in a lot of spoken word poetry into the music that she creates. And so that actually was the first way that I first like heard about spoken word poetry was through Ani DeFranco, and really just fell in love with it. I thought it was like the coolest thing. And so when I was in high school, I was the editor-in-chief of my school's literary magazine. I organized a couple poetry readings, like coffee house kind of events at my school, and I just like loved those. And when I got to college in Baltimore, I sought out open mic nights because I really wanted to find ways to share my poetry and hear other people's poetry and get to meet other writers. So started going to open mics at like different coffee shops around the city. And at one of the open mics that I went to, someone said, "Hey, you should come to this poetry slam." And at the time, I had never heard of a poetry slam. And what I discovered when I went is that a poetry slam is actually pretty similar to an open mic. However, it is a competition. So in a poetry slam, there's usually about 8 or so poets who go up to perform pieces that they've written themselves. And often these pieces are memorized, but they don't have to be, and sometimes they're not. And it is, like I said, a piece of their own original creation. It's just them up there on the stage or makeshift stage, whatever is possible. And 5 random audience members who do not know the poet or have any affiliation with the poet are asked to be judges. And the judges are given Olympic style scorecards. And after each poem, they hold up a score. The score can be anywhere from 0 to 10, 0 being the worst poem you've ever heard in your life, 10 being the best poem you've ever heard in your life. So as you can imagine, most scores fall somewhere in the middle. The high and the low score are thrown out. The middle 3 are averaged together to give the poet their score. And usually at the end of the night, the winner of the slam is the person with the highest score. And often at venues that have poetry slams, if poets come back week after week and compete in these different slams throughout the year, they can qualify to represent that venue at national and international poetry competitions, which happen all over the world. Kind of like the Olympics. Like one year it might be in Chicago, another year it might be in London or San Francisco or different places. And so I'd say most of them are in the US, but I have, through poetry, I've traveled, I've performed poetry across the country, I've performed it in England and New Zealand. I've gotten to meet incredible poets from all over the world, which has been really cool because it's also meant that anywhere I've traveled to, I've had a friend that I've met through poetry who I can meet up with. They usually will, help me get some kind of like local opportunity to perform or to teach a workshop, which is something I love to do. And it's just been an amazing way to connect with people all over the world who all love the same thing, who all love the idea of, taking our life experiences and putting them into words in ways that allow us to connect with other people. So I started competing in these poetry slams when I was 19 years old. I got to be on a couple different national poetry slam teams, got to represent some venues both in Maryland and then eventually in New York City, where I moved a few years after that. So went to National Poetry Slam, the Individual Poetry Slam, the Women of the World Poetry Slam, and it really has been an incredible experience for me. I don't really compete anymore. It's actually been a very long time since I've competed in a poetry slam. I still like to perform though. So that means I get up, I perform my poems, but no one's giving me a score. Um, and It's been great. It's been great to still be able to do that. And just to say that, some people really like the competitive aspect of being scored. I think a good thing about it is that it's a great way to engage people. The whole idea behind Poetry Slam, behind the whole idea of having audience members be judges, is to make people feel more involved. So it's not just like the only person having fun is the poet performing, but like everyone's involved, everyone has a role to play. The audience members who aren't judges, they are supposed to be responding in however way they want to respond. So like if the poet performing says something funny, the audience members are encouraged to laugh. If they hear a line that they like, they're encouraged to snap their fingers, or they can say like, yeah, or they, however they want to emote, they are encouraged to do that. If they like the score that a judge gives a poet, they're encouraged to cheer. If they don't like the score, but they really want to support the poet, they're encouraged to cheer. It's meant to be interactive. It's meant for everyone to have a role to play. And for poetry to really be this exciting, dynamic experience that maybe goes beyond what some of us might have initially thought of when we think of poetry. We might think of like people sitting around reading Robert Frost quietly. No offense to Robert Frost, but slam poetry is meant to show us that poetry doesn't have to be quiet or solitary. It can be a way that we can connect with other people, and it can be fun and exciting and energetic. So if you are interested in seeing more slam poetry, you can look on YouTube. There is a ton of stuff on there. Button Poetry is a producer of different spoken word videos. You can find a lot of stuff through them. And personally, when I think about writing a good performance piece, I think about it differently than I think about writing poems for what I call the page. For me, I kind of differentiate page and stage in my mind. So a poem I write for the stage is a poem where, as I'm writing it, I'm thinking about how it's going to sound to be performed. So I might think about rhythm or alliteration or putting jokes in there or making sure there's like a cadence to my energy level. If I'm writing something for the page, I'm really thinking more about like literary techniques. I'm thinking about like, am I doing a form poem where I'm writing like using specific kind of different literary techniques, things that are not quite as easy to pick up on when you just hear something versus when you're reading it on a piece of paper. So I'd say that now I tend to write more of the page poems, but still have some of the spoken word poems in my arsenal. I still write a few of them once in a while when I have performances, and it's still really fun. I love it. I love being up in front of people and performing. So excited to do a poem for you all in a couple minutes. But before I do, I wanted to talk a little bit about storytelling techniques. So I am going to share my screen. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes a good speaker and what makes a good storyteller. The reason I'm focusing on storytelling as opposed to literary techniques is because I think when it comes to spoken word poetry, it is really about oral storytelling. I think that, can talk more about literary techniques maybe in a different context. But I wanted to talk about what it means to craft a story in a thoughtful way and to present it in a way that's really exciting to the audience who's listening to you. So when I think about what makes a good story, I think about stories being accessible, concise, and inspiring. And I'm going to talk about each of those piece by piece. But before I do, I want to talk about the rule of three. So the rule of three is a really interesting literary technique. It really comes down to how we think and remember examples. It can be helpful if you want to share different examples of something within your story, if you're trying to get a message out that has different components to it, because it's easier for people to remember in threes than fives, for example. It's just kind of the way our brains tend to group information. So if you think about it, there's lots of different ways in which we use the rule of three, maybe without even thinking about it. And these kind of different buckets of how we think about culture, how we think about education, government branches, jokes, three people walk into a bar, in different, quotes that you may have heard of that are familiar to you. This is just a little picture from Broad City. That is a cute little rule of three graphic that I really like. And it's just something to keep in mind if you have any moment in your poem where you're listing things, just to keep that in the back of your mind as a tool that you can use. Okay, so I mentioned at the start of this document the need to be accessible. What I mean by being accessible is making sure that your audience stays with you, that you don't lose them by using language that they might not understand, by using acronyms that might be unfamiliar to them. Don't set up a situation in which people have to pause and think, wait, I don't know what that means. I have to Google that. Because if they do, then they're not listening to the rest of what you're saying. Another thing is conversational tone of voice. So talk when you're performing, try to talk as if you are telling a story to your friends or your family, and ground yourself in the story that you're telling. By that, I mean, try to remember how you felt when you were initially writing this down. So if there's a funny moment, laugh, smile. If you feel moved, that's great. Like, let yourself feel moved. Tell it as if you're telling it for the very first time. Because if it starts to feel mechanical to you, the audience is going to pick up on that. But if when you're performing it, you're really selling the authenticity of that moment and that story, then that's going to resonate with them, and they're going to want to listen to you, and they're going to want to be on that journey with you. Be concise. Unfortunately, this is kind of just a truth of our time, that people have really short attention spans. That's why poetry slams are set up where each poem is 3 minutes or less, because after 3 minutes, people tend to kind of stop paying attention. So it's better to leave people wanting more than to have them get bored. Inspire empathy. I think this is a big one, because I think that, first of all, I think we all have unique stories. I think it's impossible for us all to have the same story. In fact, that would be really boring. And so it's okay if your story is specific to you. You can still find ways in the way that you tell it to connect with your audience in a way that feels really universal. So even though only you has your own story of like what it was like to grow up, where you grew up, or different experiences you've had, only I have the experience of what it was like to grow up in my family. But there are certain emotions or certain experiences that everyone can relate to. So for example, like, everyone knows what it feels like to be really excited about something, whether it's a musician you really like, or a movie or a book that you really connected to. Even if when you're telling that story, someone didn't have the same experience with Tori Amos that I had, they still know what it feels like to love a song or love a musician or love something, you know? And that's a way that people can kind of like nod and be like, oh yeah, I know what that feels like. And you have that recognition. And that way people feel like they're a part of your story, that they're kind of going on this adventure with you. Throw in some humor and a smile. I know I mentioned that before. I think that's a big one though, because it helps your audience relax if you give them a chance to laugh. And it also might make you feel more relaxed too. Be specific, but not in the weeds. By that, I mean include details that serve your story. So include information that helps someone who's trying to understand your story, but don't include information that doesn't kind of serve the narrative. So for example, if it's important for your story to say, I was hanging out with my best friend, we were eating chocolate ice cream on a summer afternoon. You may not need to mention how many calories were in the ice cream or where you got the ice cream, unless that's like necessary for someone to understand the story. And inspire action. I love this because for me, what I most want is for someone to hear me perform and leave thinking that they want to go home and write a poem, or that they want to learn more about poetry, or just that they feel good. Like that's what I most want. I want people to come away from hearing me and feel something. And so that's why I mentioned the rule of three. So if there's like a message you really want people to remember, using the rule of three is a great way to make sure that it kind of sticks in their head. Leave them with a memorable takeaway. Stick the landing. So something I like to do in my poems, which I think you'll see in this poem I'm going to perform after this, is I like to give people a really specific memory at the beginning of my poem and then come back to it at the end. And what that does is when you come back to that memory at the end, the people listening are like, oh yeah, I remember that. And then they feel like they're a part of this conversation. Like it's not just you up there telling a story, but like they're with you. And it's a great way to help your audience feel engaged. Another point here is like, let's say you have a story you really want to share, and maybe it's not the happiest of endings, but it's still a story that's really important to you. That's okay. I think what matters is how you package the story. What is the lesson, or what do you want the message of your poem to be? That's really important, and it can be whatever it is you want it to be. It's your story. It's your performance. It's your adventure that you are taking us all on. So now that I have talked about technique and all of these things, what I would like to do now is actually share a poem with you all. So I'm going to share a poem called Hope. This is actually one of the first spoken word poems I wrote and performed for folks. And yeah, it's one that's kind of close to my heart. Hope is the stupid little yellow bird who used to batter his skull into my living room window over and over and over again with unrelenting excitement, as if that next desperate surge forward would melt his wings through glass, softly shoving aside molecules for twig-like bones to pass through, and all of this for the lovebird screaming behind bars. And he thought, her wings may be clipped, but man, she is fly. Wanted to make her tweet his name, and so every day for 6 months, his head thumping harmonized with the clanking of breakfast spoons. And my sister would look up from her Cheerios and say, that bird is stupid. And all these years later, I look up and say, no, that bird is hope. And sometimes hope seems stupid to everyone but the one hoping, and everyone hopes for something. The truth is, I pretend to be a cynic, but I am really a dreamer who is terrified of wanting something she may never get. After this last heartache, I decided myself I should take Jay-Z's advice and be forever macking, but the truth is, I have no game, and my pickup lines are all haikus. I just want to show you the energy that crackles beneath my veins like exposed power lines, like my potential is as infinite as these blurred faces rushing past me, and that's how I feel every time you call me, like even our silences end in dot, 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 like who knows what could happen. And I have no flight plan, just a speck in the distance of something that just might be close to beautiful. So why not unfold these wings, crush empty air between them like empty excuses, like this crush on you is crushing me. And I am a crush monster. I can crush us on ideas and ideals and nonprofit organizations. And I can think of nothing sweeter than spending my days making this world better. And my dad says, okay, Joanna, but there are bills to pay. And I can't even say how many grown-ups have tossed me similar consolation prizes. Like the woman who came up to me once after a poetry reading and said, your idealism's real cute, but you'll grow up one day. And you should know, things will only get worse from here. And I should have said, lady, you had better pray I never grow up. Because if there weren't people out there who believed in possibility, nothing would ever get done. I believe in evolution like a river, slowly winding its way up a mountain like a broken winged bird, spiraling to heaven. Things can only go up from here, and miracles happen every day. So I hope for the day I can sit at a Jerusalem bar with my Arab friends, and the only dispute will be over who buys the beer. And I hope for the wedding I've wanted ever since I knew how to want, and maybe hope is stupid, as long as hope is a kamikaze whisper from your lips, never meant to go anywhere but crashing down, and maybe that's why it does. But I believe in a hope that flies, like a little yellow bird soaring into your living room through a window that has been open all along. Thank you all so much for listening, for engaging. I hope you all are staying safe and creating art in however way feels good to you. Sending you all a virtual hug and hope to see you soon.